Conscription is the mandatory enlistment into the military for those who are eligible for a certain period of time, and the government had the power to enforce it during World War I. It refers to the process of automatically calling up men for military service. First World War men who were conscripted into the armed forces had no choice but to go and fight, even if they did not want to. Conscription during the First World War began when the British government passed the Military Service Act in January 1916. The Act specified that single men aged 18 to 40 years old were liable to be called up for the military service unless they were widowed with children or ministers of a religion. There were a few other exceptions for the disabled, those with special skills or essential jobs, and the conscientious objectors, which are simply people who did not want to fight in World War I. Thousands of conscripts, particularly French-speaking ones, refused to be sent to the front and went into hiding. Federal agents combed the countryside. While some men successfully hid from the draft, 100,000 men were finally called up and put in uniform. Half that number crossed the Atlantic, but only 25,000 reached the front before the end of the war on November 11, 1918. The debate over conscription consumed and divided the country. Although some French Canadians supported it and some English Canadians did not, for the most part, English Canada backed Prime Minister Robert Borden on conscription.
Besides all this conflict, Borden managed to push the Military Service Act through Parliament, and it became law on August 29, 1917. It made all male citizens, aged 18 to 45, subject to call up for military service through the end of the war. His opponents were primarily farmers, trade unionists, non-British immigrants, pacifists, and most of French Canada, including almost every French-speaking member of Parliament. Riots over the issue broke out in Quebec, where support for the war had always been lukewarm.
The Military Service Act of 1917 was a controversial law allowing the conscription of Canadian men for service in the final years of the First World War.
Although politically explosive, the act had a questionable military value. Only 24,132 conscription men made it to the battlefields of the Western Front, compared to the 400,000 who volunteered throughout the war.
For many Canadians, it was an important and necessary contribution to a faltering war effort. For others, it was an impressive act passed dishonestly by a government more British than Canadian. Conscription would have minimal impact on Canada's war effort. In November 1918, only 48,000 conscripts had been sent overseas, half of which ultimately served at the front. More than 50,000 more conscripts remained in Canada. These would have been required had the war continued in 1919. The war may have ended, but the fallout of the conscription issue would continue long after. For many years, the Conservative Party, which had brought in conscription, found it hard to get votes in Quebec. The conscription crisis stuck in the minds of the French Canadians in the decades to come. The memories fueled the flames of growing French nationalist passions and created a permanent wedge in Canada's linguistic divide. Many soldiers were forced to leave their homes, their loved ones, and their lives to fight in this war. Sadly, most of them never made their way back home to their children and their wives.
What I did remember was on the eve of the battle, the night before they were to go over at the dawn and the next morning, was the combined armaments all crashing out together, and the whole earth trembled. The lines holding down the balloon were shaking, and you could feel the vibrations coming up through the earth, up through your limbs, all through your body. You were all of a tremor, just by artillery fire only. Not so much perhaps the crashing of the shells as the gunfire at rear, all concentrating in one wild blast of gunfire. It was shattering. The whole ground trembled, and you felt sorry for anybody within half a mile of wherever they were firing at. It must have been terrible for them.